Recording now. Welcome to the week 3 go-to session. So this is the third of 4 sessions that we're holding this month. The good news is this probably should be a shorter session, just because there's not as much to go over this week. We're kind of winding, well, I shouldn't say winding down. We're halfway through the course, but I'd say the hardest part is behind you. The next 2 weeks are a little bit lighter, and that's by design. So this week, you're mostly going to have to concentrate on peer review. And then you have week 4, which is pretty much free for you to work on revisions. And also, and we're going to talk more about it next week, so I'm not going to get too much into it today, but taking your essay once it's revised and presenting it in a brand new format. But mostly the schedule is clear for the next 2 weeks. And again, that's by design. You do a lot of the heavy work the first 2 weeks in terms of researching, in terms of posting your work to the board, writing your essay. Just a quick reminder. Remember that the essay date has been changed. Okay, I think most people are aware of this, but it's due tomorrow night, Tuesday night at midnight, because of the Labor Day interruption. I sent out an announcement to my class reminding people of this so they didn't freak out and hand in subpar work before what would typically be the normal due date, Sunday, right? But please note that the due dates get back on track starting this week. So we're returning to the typical, things are due by Sunday at midnight. Okay, but there were some adjustments this week, and it won't really seriously affect peer review in any meaningful way. But there are some tiny things that I'll raise throughout this session. Okay, so welcome to week 3. As I've already indicated, the main thing we're going to be working on this week is peer review. We only have a couple people in the room, but have people done some sort of version of peer review before in the past? Maybe when you were in high school, or maybe you took a college level class somewhere else. Rosalind says yes. And what form did that take? Was it sort of like you'd come into the class and the teacher would put you into groups, right? And you exchange papers? Maybe you have a set of guiding questions to consider as you exchange papers and give each other feedback. So if you've done something like that in the past, this is kind of similar, but it's different in some ways as well. In a good way, I think, because as you know, some people, students often say things like, "Well, online classes are different for me. I'm not used to them," and I get that, right? If you're living in Boise, Idaho, or Buffalo, New York, online classes can feel a bit distant, although Miss Fox, Miss Chapman, Miss Sullivan, and I think we all work very, very hard to lessen that feeling. When I respond to student messages pretty quickly, or sometimes at odd times, like 3 in the morning, I think in some ways you have more access to the instructor in the online environment than you do in the traditional classroom. So you should always take advantage of it. But one of the real, I think, awesome benefits of the online system is that, when students come in to do a peer review activity in class in real time, it can strike some of the students as sort of like busy work. They grunt, they groan. The last thing they want to do that day is be put into groups and have to exchange papers. So one of the great things about the online version is that because we're dealing with an asynchronous environment, that's just a fancy word for to express that the class isn't occurring in real time, right? If you want to do work at 3 in the morning, you can do it. If the rest of the world is watching football on Sunday, but you want to focus on your classwork, you can do so. But it also helps with peer review because you can carve out the specific time and space to actually work on peer review. You don't have to feel pressured that you only have these 45 minutes or this hour and 15 minutes to get peer review done. Okay. Peer review is also important because you're working on your essays right now, which again are due Tuesday at midnight. And really for the rest of the week, you're going to be getting a lot of feedback. You're going to get feedback from your instructors, but you're also going to get feedback from one another. And it's this part of the process that we really get excited about and love to stress its importance, because getting feedback from others helps us identify what could be improved in our own writing. So this is the sort of bulk of this week's activity, okay? To find out how effectively we've actually communicated our ideas, right? I mean, one of the difficult things about communication in general, whether it's in writing or whether it's in speech, is that the things that are in our heads seem absolutely clear to us. But then we have to make sure that they really are as understandable in our own heads as they are when we kind of distribute it out into the world. And peer review is a great way to get feedback on that. Okay. A quick overview. There are some benefits you get from receiving feedback, and they go beyond just, oh, hey, I'm getting feedback on my work and I know what to improve, although that's obviously important. So if we look at these bullet points that are on the slide, yes, obviously you get to discover what's working in your writing. And that's important too, right? It's not just a matter of pointing out what's not working. It's also important to get feedback on what is working. Um, but yes, obviously you also learn where your writing needs to improve. You can get an objective point of view on your work. Okay, that's really important. Again, that someone else other than you is giving you feedback, not just from your instructors. I mean, you're going to get feedback, detailed feedback from us, but you're going to get feedback from your peers too. And we're going to talk about how to craft good feedback later in the session. But it's important because you'd be amazed all the time. Students point out terrific things when they really put their full effort into peer review. Students point out things that sometimes I miss, or maybe I didn't miss, but it didn't occur to me when I was giving feedback. So ideally here, you should be getting feedback from hopefully at least three people, your instructor, and then hopefully at least two of your classmates. And that's all in an effort to give you that sort of objective look at your own work, which can be difficult for you to do on your own, right? Because sometimes you've looked at your essay for the 10th time, or you've looked at the paper so many times that you can't make heads or tails out of things, right? It just seems like a jumbled mass of words. You can't get perspective on it. So why not let others take a look at it? Obviously, it can help you identify mistakes you can't see. That's just a continuation of what I talked about. It's really difficult for you to see things when you've spent so long with your paper. Rosalind says, take a screenshot of this. It'll be on the quiz. Or no, Rochelle says that, excuse me. Yes, that's a good point. Yeah, take notes, take a screenshot, because this will help you with your weekly check-in. If you haven't caught on already, people tend to do better on the weekly check-ins when they can make specific reference to either the reading materials, the handouts, the information in these go-to sessions. And when students just try to guesstimate, right? They try to just answer the questions from their gut. They usually don't do as well. So yes, these issues that you're seeing here will relate to one of the weekly check-in questions. Joshua says, how do you do that again? I think he's talking about a screenshot, so I'll let maybe Ms. Chapman or Ms. Fox answer that. Okay. And real quickly, just some other things. Yeah, you can improve on the areas that you struggle with. You learn to accept constructive criticism. That's a pretty big one too. I keep hearing from students way back in week one. Remember your weekly check-in for that first week. One of the questions had to do with I think it was, take a look at the syllabus, take a look at the course objectives, and talk about what you're excited about this class. Talk about what you're nervous about. So many students mentioned peer review, and I get it. Like, it's never perhaps pleasant to get feedback, but it's not really that anxiety producing. It's pretty rare. I can't really even think of instances where a student has just gone rogue and been unprofessional on the board. That doesn't really happen. Peer review is pretty painless, so don't get nervous. But it does teach you how to accept constructive criticism, because you'll get this all your life. Okay, a lot of you are in creative disciplines. Some of you are here to study music. Some of you are here from film. You're going to be in situations where you'll have to listen to the ideas and opinions of others. Okay. And lastly, yeah, you get to practice applying feedback to improve your own work. Actually taking what I have said to you, or your other instructors or your classmates, and actually put it into practice. Okay, a real quick reminder. Okay, so your essay is due Tuesday night at midnight. And then to get the peer review activity started, you essentially just have to post your draft to the board. But that's not all you do, okay? When you post your work to the discussion board, you also have to answer some personal reflection questions. And I'm going to get away from the presentation for just a second and show you the assignment sheet. Okay, that's the rubric. So here's the peer review assignment sheet. There's page one. I'm going to skip down to I guess it's page 3, where the instructions actually begin. This is where you find the self-reflection questions, and you get very, very specific instructions on what to do. For example, copy and paste your essay to the peer review discussion board, right? So that would be There we go. Internet's working a little slow, but if you can see here, week 3. Okay, so this is the activity we're talking about, peer review. And don't think anybody's posted in my class yet, but it's just a matter of going to this board and posting your work. Please copy and paste the actual text of your essay directly into your post. Okay. Um, I know some of you have your essays saved in some sort of cloud-based version, right? You have it saved to Google Docs, or you have it saved to Dropbox, or you have it saved in some other format, and then you just post the link here. Don't do that. For one, your students might not be able to open it. Okay, I'm pretty patient. I can usually find a way to open most student documents, even though I shouldn't have to. But I'm just telling you, if your classmates cannot open your document, they're just going to skip right on to the next essay. As a matter of fact, there will be some of your peers who will see a link and just say, "Nope, I'm not doing it. I'm going to the next one." So yeah, please copy and paste the actual text of your assignment onto the board. Rosalind asks, "Will it stay in APA?" Yes and no. I don't worry so much about the formatting issues. If it's not double spaced, or if your references can't capture the indentation rules exactly. I think, I'll say it here just to remind people. That's not the main focus. Obviously, if people notice issues like with in-text citations or the actual content of your references, they can still comment on that, even if the formatting or layout is a little bit off. But yeah, um, just as Ms. Fox says, your classmates are really giving feedback on content, not so much the formatting. And that means like you can just copy the text over, so you don't have to bring over your cover page, for instance. Okay. Just make sure that the text is actually in your post. What is Ms. Fox saying? Your instructor will give you feedback on formatting. Yeah, I mean, we'll all give you feedback on APA. And later in the session, we're going to talk about where you should begin with peer review, like what to focus on, what's most important. And the APA is kind of a lesser issue. Um, okay, what was I talking about? Oh, yeah. On the instructions, you have these self-reflection questions. Okay, so you're going to copy and paste your essay and references to the board. Then you have to answer this series of questions. Okay. And you should be answering them with some care. For example, which parts of your essay do you feel most closely meet the expectations for exceptional writing as described in the rubric? Be specific. Okay. So, take a look at the rubric. Here it is. Hopefully you've been looking at them all month. If you haven't, these are really useful tools. So why not take a peek at them? Because they let you know exactly what you need to do to score maximum points in terms of, well, in this case, it's the actual rubric for this peer review assignment. But if you open up the rubric, for example, for the essay assignment, you'll see that you get graded on focus, on content, on APA. Okay, so actually I should have opened up that rubric instead. But yeah, take a look at the rubric for the essay assignment and be specific about in what ways you think your essay is meeting the expectations. Second, which parts of your essay could use improvement? Again, be specific. And then finally, identify at least 2 parts of your essay that you feel need improvement. Okay. The idea here is that you're asking your peers specific questions that you probably want answered first and foremost. It doesn't mean that your classmates can't touch on other things. For instance, maybe the 2 things that you mentioned aren't the biggest issues, although ideally they should be if you're taking this question seriously. But yeah, identify at least 2 parts that you think really need improvement. And you get some examples here, okay? So here's an example of a specific question that a student is asking, right? I'm not going to read it out loud because it's kind of long. But then here's an example of a non-specific question. So if you just run to the board and say, hey, do you see any grammar errors I could fix? Like, that's not really a thoughtful question, okay? So yeah, you're posting your work to the board and you're accompanying that. You're going to answer these questions. Typically, they usually appear after the pasted essay, but you just need to make sure that they're there. Okay, so let me get back to my presentation. Give me a second here. My cursor has completely disappeared for some reason. Let me try that again. There we go. Okay, so don't forget the self-reflection questions because that's part of the assignment. We just talked earlier about how you benefit from receiving feedback. There are also benefits you get from giving feedback, and these might involve another weekly check-in question, so you might want to take notes or take a screenshot. But you get to practice applying the writing and critical thinking skills you have learned to assess the quality of written text. Okay, that sounds pretty fancy, right? But really, they're not just a jumble of words. They're actual. Okay, you get to practice critical thinking skills, and I can say as an instructor, I actually get a lot of I get a lot of rewards every single month responding to student papers. Um, is facing, grading 50 papers always a delight? No, but one of the things I really do like about it is that every essay is a unique challenge for me, right? It's a unique set of words on the page, excuse me, that you created and that I have to respond to. And it gives me a chance to sort of practice my skills, and I learn a lot from it. Maybe there's something you did that I find impressive that I would like to imitate. Or maybe in pointing out something that's a concern, I'm actually learning in the process as well. So yeah, it's really a sort of give and take action here. You get feedback, but you're also learning a tremendous amount when you give feedback. Okay. Second, you learn how to recognize what is working and what needs improvement in a piece of writing. Again, it seems like it's almost invisible, but you actually learn a tremendous amount just by looking at another person's work and giving feedback. You get to strengthen your ability to recognize errors in your own work by pointing them out in others. That's also key. I once had a teacher who said, that's actually probably the most important part of responding to another's work, is that you're actually learning about your own values. You're actually learning about what you find most important and most crucial. Okay. Um, and we do that by pointing out this in others' writing. And then the next bullet point kind of continues that same idea, that you get to learn what you value in writing. And you get to develop critiquing skills by practicing constructive criticism, because you're going to keep needing these skills. You're going to need them in your future classes at Full Sail. And again, this isn't uncommon, right? A lot of you are heading into somewhat creative fields. So this won't end even when you leave Full Sail. So why not get a head start on these things now? Okay, so we already know that we have to post our work to the discussion board. The essay is due Tuesday at midnight, so figure that sometime Wednesday you should be posting your work and answering those self-reflection questions. Technically, the activity opens up tonight at midnight, so for those of you who are already done with your essay, you can get a head start and go ahead and do that if you wish. But yeah, considering that this activity ends on Sunday, the peer review activity, yeah, it's pretty important that we get our work posted quickly, okay? But what do you do? You've posted your work. Now it's time to respond to others. How do we go about doing that? Okay. What we're going to cover now are some different methods you can use when you practice peer review. Okay. And after we cover some of the methods, we're also going to give some basic suggestions on, the sorts of things that you should keep in mind when you're actually writing out the text of your reviews. Remember, you're responding to at least two of your classmates' papers. Before we get into those specific methods, however, there's one pretty important concept to keep in mind, and this might relate to one of your weekly check-in questions as well. I think it's useful to think of peer review in terms of global issues versus local issues. This slide here covers global issues, and when I say global issues, we're not talking about things that are in the news like poverty or climate change. Okay, we're not talking about those sorts of global issues. We're talking about global issues as they apply to your writing. Some other instructors might refer to them as big picture issues or higher order issues. So all three of those terms are synonymous. Basically, we're talking about issues that affect your paper as a whole, right? These are like the big things, the things that need to be fixed if there are some major problems. Issues of focus. Okay, is there a concentrated focus from beginning to end, which in the case of your essay means, do you have a clear role model, and are you sticking with the issue of perseverance from beginning to end? Development, okay, so the specific details that are in your paper. Organization, do ideas flow? Do we naturally move from one sentence to the next? Do paragraphs stay singular in their focus? Ideally, we should have at least one topic or one issue or one point per paragraph. And also general overall problems with style and tone. Okay. Global issues are the more important ones. These are the ones we have to address first. And that should seem sort of self-explanatory, right? I mean, if there are major problems, I shouldn't say major, but if there are some semi-big problems in the essay, the writer needs to hear about those first. Okay, those are things that need to be fixed. So, for example, if perseverance isn't really on the page, we've been talking about this all month. I even sent out a reminder in an announcement, right? If perseverance isn't on the page, the writer probably needs to hear that. Okay, if the writer's just listing biographical facts or just listing accomplishments, but not really telling that human story that's behind those accomplishments, the hard work, right, the perseverance, the student probably needs to hear that. Or maybe perseverance is on the page, but it just doesn't feel very organized. For half the paragraph, the writer is talking about point A, and then out of nowhere, she immediately jumps to point B within the same paragraph, and it's such an abrupt shift that it's sort of jarring, right? That's an organizational issue. So these sorts of matters need to be addressed first. Elizabeth says, so these go-to training sessions count as attendance. I mean, I guess. This isn't like other classes where I know there are other classes here at Full Sail where if you attend the go-to session, you actually have to fill out an attendance thing at the end. Here in English, we don't do that. If you attend, awesome, great. You've already done what you need to do as a student. You're already prepared for this week's activities. If people watch it after the fact, that's great too. Okay. But yeah, there's no official attendance that we take. We see your attendance when you take the weekly check-in or when you hand in your work, and I don't mean that to sound mean. Okay, it's just there are ways that students show that they're keeping up with material without us having to take attendance. Okay, so the opposite of global issues are obviously local issues, also known as small picture or lower order issues. And you can already guess what this means, right? It's all the small stuff: grammar, mechanics, spelling, capitalization, proofreading. It's not that this stuff doesn't have any importance. It does, but it's definitely a lower order concern. Okay, it's the last thing that we focus on, because if there are big chunks of the assignment that need to be improved, then why worry about individual sentences? Right? Those sentences might disappear. Those sentences might be completely ditched when you revise. So why worry so much about fixing them? Okay. And also, as a warning, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the upcoming slides. But students, I think, sometimes gravitate toward local concerns first because they somehow seem safer. Because the student thinks, well, gosh, I don't know how to respond. What am I going to say in response to this paper? I have no idea. So they focus on what they're comfortable with, like, ooh, there's a spelling error, or oh, I think there's a missing comma, right? So they sort of avoid, not on purpose, by the way, but they sort of avoid the harder work and the true purpose of peer review by going to what's safe, which is just pointing out grammar and spelling and capitalization. It's not that you can't mention these things at all, but these are things that if you do mention them, you mention them at the end in passing. Okay, the global issues come first. Now we're going to talk about different methods you can use when you jump onto the peer review board to give feedback. The first method is called the RISE model. Probably you've heard this before. Okay. Um, I know in creative presentation, if you've taken that class at Full Sail, the RISE model is used. I believe in psychology of play, it's also used. Okay, so you should be kind of familiar with the RISE model, but if you're not, we're going to go into more detail about it right now. Okay, so RISE is this word where if we take the first letter of each of the words in RISE, spell out the concepts that we need to follow, which is to reflect, to inquire, to suggest, and to elevate. So if we look at the first step, to reflect, this means to recall, ponder, and communicate. Simply put, reflect is the part that students are often pretty good at. So if we think back to the week one discussion board where you posted your research, students do a pretty good job at being able to read what their classmates have written, to consider it somewhat thoughtfully, to comment on it. But that's actually just one stage of the process. So if you're not moving beyond the reflection stage, which is just kind of acknowledging what the person has written and responding thoughtfully to it, you're not taking the discussion and the peer review to the highest possible level. Beyond reflecting, we also need to inquire. Okay. So this could take the form of, for example, I relate, I agree, I disagree with X because of, and then you fill the rest with specific comments. Or I like what you did with, I don't know, your introduction or your closing paragraph because, okay, so we're taking it beyond just sort of echoing what's already been posted and giving our personal opinions, and we're taking it to sort of the next level. Okay, we're inquiring, we're actually digging into what the student has posted. The next step is to, oops, I think I got that a little bit backwards there. Okay, so I gave some examples of reflection. Inquire means asking thoughtful questions. Okay, so pretty much what I just discussed, but we're putting it in question form. Have you considered looking at X from this perspective? When you said such and such, am I understanding you to mean this or that? Okay, so we're actually kind of asking questions. And again, back to the week one discussion, people are pretty good at reflecting. Some students took it to the next level and did ask questions, but sometimes the discussion sort of stops there. The next step in the process is to make suggestions. Okay, so we've acknowledged what the student has written. We've asked some thoughtful questions. Next is the idea is, and this is the important part of actual constructive criticism, is to actually offer suggestions. Okay, so we're introducing ideas for improvement, and we're being specific when we do so. Okay, so if we notice, for example, I don't know, that the introduction is just very short and very mechanical, and we think it could be richer or more attention grabbing, we might suggest a way that it could be more powerful. Or if we notice that there's a problem in organization, we might suggest ways to improve that. Hey, I noticed that things shift mid paragraph here. You might consider making those two separate paragraphs. Um, Keep in mind too that suggestions also include things like is the student following the assignment instructions? Okay, this is week 3 now. We have a pretty good handle on what the assignment's about. So sometimes your peers might just be missing a key part of the assignment. So maybe perseverance is really strong on the page, but they sort of forgotten that other part, the part where they need to connect it to themselves. Right? After you discuss your chosen role model's perseverance, you have to discuss what you learned from that perseverance and how it specifically applies to your future path, both as a full sales student and as you enter your own industries. So if you don't see those things happening, you're perfectly allowed to to reflect, inquire, and suggest, hey, I think you're missing an important piece of the assignment here. You should consider filling those things in. I say this only because I can't speak for Miss Fox or Miss Chapman, and we'll get into this with some of the upcoming slides. But yeah, if we just rubber stamp comments, we can actually ignore important pieces. So I'm always surprised when peer feedback says this looks great or this looks terrific, and a core piece of the assignment is missing. So we can also comment on those things. And the final step in the process is to elevate. Okay, so we're taking the first 3 steps and just bringing it to a higher level. Okay, so we've acknowledged what they've written, we've asked questions, we've made suggestions, and elevating is really sort of kind of topping things off. Okay, and you get some examples there. Perhaps you can expand this. Perhaps you can further address X. Perhaps you can repurpose these things. Okay, so we're kind of taking it one step further. We're taking our suggestions and being a bit more specific about how that can improve the paper overall. The second method, and by the way, these methods don't all have to be used independently. You can mix and match. But method number 2 is called the compliment sandwich. You can probably guess what that means just from the sound of it, right? Our ultimate job here is, yes, to offer some constructive criticism, some helpful advice, but because just doing so directly can seem a bit harsh or a bit too forward, we sort of buffer what we say with things that are positive. Now, it doesn't mean we're just making generic comments about what's positive, right? We're not just trying to find something insincere to say. but that we're being, again, very, very specific about what's working well. Typically, in just about any paper, there will be something that's working well. Okay. Maybe one of the student examples that she uses to demonstrate perseverance is really terrific. So why not point that out? Um, Maybe the closing part of the paper is really powerful and ends in a natural way. That could be something that you compliment and point out. But the idea is we're sort of softening our actual suggestions. We're not being insincere. We're not trying to talk around the issue. We're just being honest and saying, this is working well. Here's a concern. And then follow that with, here's another thing that's working well. The thing I want to point out here is that the compliment sandwich is not something we do just once and call it a day. So peer review is not does not mean running to the board, saying something nice, pointing out one thing of concern, saying something nice, and then leaving. It's a process that can be repeated. Okay, as you point out various things in the paper, and they can be used in combination with the RISE model. So you can do these exact things: compliment, critique, compliment, and still practice those things from the previous slide. Right? Reflect, inquire, suggest, elevate. Okay, and these words here kind of describe what I was just explaining. Method number 3, which in some ways is kind of a variation on the RISE model because it includes a lot of the essential parts. They kind of have different names, but this is the describe, explain, advise model. Again, you can pick and choose among these 3 methods. You can mix and match. I can't speak for the other instructors. To me, what's most important is that you're putting your best effort forward. You're trying to help your fellow classmates. You're being specific in your advice that you have to give them. And if you can do that using any of these 3 methods, that's great. But in the describe, explain, advise model, okay, well, first we begin by describing the issue in detail. So in some ways, this is similar to the kind of reflect step. We're kind of acknowledging what's on the page and we're describing it. Next, we move to sort of a higher level and we explain, we give further information about that issue or problem. Okay, so first we're just describing it. Next, we're giving more detail about what that means exactly. And then here, similar to kind of the RISE model, we're kind of offering suggestions. We're giving advice, okay? We're giving specific advice how to fix the issue or improve the issue or solve the problem, okay? Oops, I went too fast there. So yeah, you can use any of these 3 methods. You can use them all. You can mix and match. The idea here is to give good feedback. And that actually leads me to a question that I want to ask the people in the room. So you can either use the chat section, or if you're feeling brave, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask your question out loud. But for those of you who have done peer feedback in the past, okay, so maybe you've been in a traditional classroom where you were put into groups and you had to exchange papers, or maybe you've done it in some other version. If we think about what sorts of peer feedback is helpful versus not helpful, let's start with not helpful. Like just using either your past experiences or common sense, or if you haven't had peer review in the past, but you can sort of guesstimate what sort of feedback isn't helpful. Can we identify some things? Like in typical, if you were to go to the discussion board and you were curious to see what your peers have written back to you in response to your paper, like what sort of stuff do you not want to see? What sort of peer feedback isn't terribly helpful? Rosalind says telling people what they want to hear. Okay, good. I'm not sure what that means exactly. Are you saying that the student is sort of rubber stamping comments, just saying sort of probably mostly positive things and just saying good job, looks great to me, or if I were an instructor I would give it an A? Right, Rosalind said everything is good. Anything else we should add to that list, things that aren't terribly helpful? Joshua says giving feedback that isn't clear. Okay, good. And Joshua, I'm guessing that maybe you mean because it's too general, or because it's not. For example, if you say that, oh, development could be stronger, but as the writer, you have no idea what that means, because which part of the paper needs more development, right? Ms. Fox is pointing out a ton of errors and then finishing up with "good job," because that sounds sarcastic. Yeah, that's another thing about being careful with like the compliment sandwich or any technique that you use, right? If we're offering positive praise too generically or too mechanically or just saving it to the end, it can come across as insincere. Other things I've heard from students in the past is, yeah, being way too general, being too friendly, or just, I call it rubber stamping the comments instead of really digging in and being specific. Other things I hear is when, for example, I don't see this often, but students who get too personal because it's not the paper they would have written, so they take issue, maybe maybe with your specific role model, right? They get caught up in the topic more than the writing itself, or even if they do focus on the writing, it seems like they're making it too personal rather than um, allowing the writer's work to stand on its own and to respond to that. So I've heard that from students. Um, I think that covers most of the big concerns. Lack of specificity, and yeah, occasionally tone. I've rarely seen a case where students are really inappropriate in terms of tone. You'll find that your classmates are actually pretty respectful. Um, but yeah, sometimes advice can seem a little bit harsh. Okay, now let me go on to the slide I was going to talk about. These are sort of qualities of constructive feedback. Okay, and again, this might relate to your weekly check-in quiz questions. Um, Good feedback, right, is specific. Whether we're pointing out things that are working well or things that need improvement, we're always being specific. Okay. Obviously, constructive feedback should be helpful. It should be considerate. Okay. Remember that online communication is different than real world communication. I think most people know this because if you've ever been on a message board and see people get really, really angry at one another, sometimes that just comes about because the things that we can communicate visually, right, through like a smile or our tone of voice or gestures, those can't be seen through a screen. So we have to be sort of hypersensitive about the way that we word things. On the other hand, that doesn't mean there's a difference between being considerate and just being super nice, right? So you're being timid or you're only giving praise, etc. I would actually say that maybe that's the number one issue I see here is that being considerate is great and being nice is perfectly fine. But not if it's holding you back from giving specific constructive advice. Okay, there's a way to do so responsibly. There's a way to do so with care. For example, I'm a big fan of using softeners and qualifiers when you write to another person. Um, you can probably figure out how to do that on your own. I'm often doing it when I respond to student work by saying things like, "Oh, I was a bit confused here," or "I was a little bit puzzled," right? I add these qualifiers a bit, a little, to sort of soften what I'm saying. It doesn't mean that I'm being insincere. It doesn't mean that I'm avoiding giving constructive feedback, but I'm aware that I have to word things a bit carefully so I don't sound too harsh or too direct, which gets into the next bullet point here, right? We don't want to be too mean either, uh, brutal or harsh. Again, I don't think that's a big problem. Maybe Miss Fox or Miss Chapman can disagree, but I rarely have. I can't. You know what? I've been at Full Sail for nearly 3 years now. I really can't think of an example where a student was just really just brutal. I mean, sometimes maybe they were direct and incredibly direct, and it wasn't their intention to sound maybe a little bit harsh, but that directness could have been misinterpreted. But even then, it was just a difference between, it was an instance of the student being very, very direct, not really brutal. So I think you'll find that peer review is a pretty painless process. But yeah, you'll need to find this balance between not being too nice and not being too mean. And I'll just say one more thing, which is that remember, we're all big boys and girls, so we should be able to handle feedback if it's appropriately written. Okay, we can decide what makes sense in terms of the advice given to us and what doesn't. And as I always say, use what's helpful and throw out the rest. That doesn't mean that you just throw it out. Okay, carefully think over what your peers have written and what your instructors have written. But yeah, you are ultimately responsible for what makes sense and what doesn't. Uh, It points out what works and what needs improvement. So that's another feature of constructive feedback. And this is a big one too. It always speaks to the writer about the piece of writing. It's not as big of an issue in peer review, though I still see it pop up sometimes. But it was a big issue back in week one when you were posting your research results to the board. People love to talk about the topics. Oh my gosh, you chose Jay-Z. I love Jay-Z. Or you chose Oprah. Oh, I love Oprah. And then they write, pretty thoughtful remarks, but it's all about how much they love Oprah or how much they love uh, Kanye West or I don't know, Killer Mike or Taylor Swift, right? It's like, okay, good, but our job here is to really respond to what's been posted to the board, the assignment, the quality of the work posted, not so much the topic itself. If you want to make a quick comment or two as an icebreaker, that's fine. But our main task is to respond to the writing, not how cool the person's chosen role model is. So be careful of that. Um, and finally, effective feedback takes time. And this is where I'll circle back to what I mentioned at the very beginning of the session. The awesome thing about online learning, and I'm being completely genuine here, is that, yeah, if you want to do this work at 3 a.m., you can do it at 3 a.m. Or if you want to read someone's paper and think it over before you head back to the board and write up your feedback, that's great. I do that all the time. I'll be washing dishes or I'll go for a walk and I'll be thinking about a student's paper. Or if you're just in a bad mood, right? You're in a foul mood and this isn't the best time to be writing peer reviews, then take a break. Or if suddenly you get a craving for a really giant burrito, go out and get the burrito. Okay, you have the time and space because of the unique setup of the online environment to come back and do the work when you're ready to do it. Now, keep in mind, you're not waiting until Sunday at 11:55 p.m. to write your critiques. All of your work is time stamped. So yeah, when I see people write really quick, rushed critiques at the last second, that's not good. Okay, the activity opens up tonight at midnight and it goes through Sunday. You have that space to write quality feedback, and because you have so much time, there's really, I would argue, not much excuse for writing thoughtful feedback to at least two of your peers. Um, there's really not much of an excuse that you couldn't find the time to read the paper with care, to think it over, to think about what's working well, to think about what needs improvement, because again, you have the time and space to do it, which is quite different than the traditional classroom where sometimes you feel like it's busy work, where sometimes you feel like you're trapped in this classroom with this activity that you really don't want to be doing. You can pick and choose your spots when you're in the right mood, when you have the highest levels of energy to complete this activity to its best. Yeah, Miss Fox gives a couple reminders. Be sure to proofread the feedback that you write. Okay, I think most people know that at this stage. But again, discussion boards. Okay, all writing at Full Sail requires the highest level of commitment to professionalism. Whether it's an essay you hand in, whether it's a discussion board post, whether it's a message to the instructor. Okay, discussion boards are not the equivalent of YouTube comment sections or Reddit threads or the website of your favorite sports team or your favorite entertainment artist. Most people know this, and if they didn't know it, we're pretty good at reminding students of this from the get-go. But that even includes things like proofreading your work to make sure that it's quality. Real quickly, because I don't want to forget this as well. When you do go to the peer review discussion board, make sure that you're spreading the wealth, okay? Because what happens is that a person posts their work to the board, and the person, whoever's paper is at the top of the discussion board, receives like a gazillion responses. But then someone whose work is bumped further down, I believe that every time someone posts, other people's posts get bumped down. But still, give attention to people who have not yet received feedback. Okay, so some person has already received 4, 5, 6 responses. Move on to someone else, please. Because there's nothing more depressing than seeing a handful of people get a ton of responses and other people get 0. I know that it's not malicious. I understand that it's not students trying to avoid the activity. Lots of times students just want to get things finished and out of the way early on, which is perfectly fine. But if you are jumping into the peer review discussion board a little bit later in the week, try to look around a bit, okay, and give attention to people who haven't yet received feedback. Okay, that pretty much covers the stuff that I wanted to go over this week. So if you have questions, this now is the time to ask them. You can use the chat or you can raise your hand. That said, if you don't have questions, you don't have to stick around. If you're pretty comfortable with what's been covered in this session and you think you have got it, you're free to go about and enjoy the rest of your day. But I will hang out for a little bit and answer questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording because it looks like questions are drying up. So I'm going to stop the recording now.